Our story begins in the United Kingdom, in the year 2013, with a young man named Lee Rigby. He was a 25-year-old British soldier hailing from Middleton in Greater Manchester. In his service, he was both a drummer and a machine gunner, a dual role that took him to the front lines in Afghanistan and later to more stately ceremonial duties at historic sites. Among these was the iconic Tower of London. By 2013, Lee had transitioned into an army recruiting post in London, where his naturally friendly and outgoing nature made him a perfect fit for engaging with potential new soldiers. His family saw him as a truly devoted soldier. His stepfather recalled that he genuinely loved his work, and he possessed a profound belief in his service. Away from his duties, Lee was a young father and a fiancé remembered by loved ones for his infectious humor and his warmth. After he had navigated the perils of service abroad, Lee's family felt a deep sense of relief, comforted by the belief that he was finally safe back home in London. Tragically, that profound sense of safety would soon be completely shattered. On the afternoon of May 22, 2013, Lee was making his way back to the Woolwich barracks. This was in southeast London, and he was wearing a hoodie bearing the name of the charity Help for Heroes, an organization that provides support to wounded military veterans. At approximately 2:20 p.m., as Lee stepped across the road, a car accelerated and swerved violently, striking him from behind. Witnesses would later recount the horrific image of the car carrying him along the pavement, before it finally smashed into a signpost. The sheer force of the collision left Lee unconscious. By all accounts, he lay incapacitated on the ground, completely unable to defend himself. This was no mere accident. What unfolded next was a brutal and frenzied assault, performed in the full light of day before numerous onlookers. Inside the car were two men, 28-year-old Michael Adebolaho and 22-year-old Michael Adeboale. These individuals emerged from the wrecked vehicle armed with a meat cleaver and knives. The moment they were out of the car, the two men descended upon Lee with an appalling level of violence, so appalling, in fact, that this event would become one of Britain's most notorious criminal cases. One of the assailants began striking at Lee's neck with the cleaver, in a clear and methodical attempt to behead him, as the other stabbed and slashed at his torso. Eyewitnesses would later state that the attacker's actions were like a butcher working on a joint of meat. Within just a few moments, in a matter of seconds, Lee had suffered extensive and catastrophic injuries, and tragically he died right there at the scene. But the attacker's performance was not yet over. Their goal was to turn their horrific act into a public spectacle. The two men proceeded to drag Lee's body into the middle of the road, placing it directly in front of oncoming traffic and terrified bystanders. They did not flee. They stood their ground, brandishing their blood-stained weapons and urging people to approach and witness what they had done. In the initial chaos, some witnesses understandably thought they had just seen a terrible traffic accident. One woman of incredible bravery, by the name of Ingrid Loyo-Kennett, got off a bus intending to provide first aid to the man on the ground. It was only then that she realized the horrifying truth of the scene. This was no accident. It was a deliberate and gruesome act of murder. And yet Ingrid didn't run. Instead, she began speaking to the men, attempting to reason with them, trying to convince them to put their weapons down. They refused. One of the killers then articulated his motive for the attack, stating plainly, "I killed him because he killed Muslims in Iraq and Afghanistan." At this point, Ingrid did something truly remarkable. She kept them talking, hoping to de-escalate and prevent further attacks. Her strategy, driven by a desperate need to distract them and stall the violence at least until the police could arrive. And so she continued to engage with the men, standing just feet from Lee's body, a solitary figure of courage in the midst of an unfolding nightmare, brandishing weapons capable of ending her life in mere seconds. Curiously, the two assailants then instructed Ingrid to keep her distance. They informed her, "We don't want to harm any women or children," suggesting they perceived their violence as being directed solely at military personnel. In their view, this was a justified and legitimate act. Meanwhile, two other passers-by also drew closer to the scene. A woman named Amanda Donnelly and her daughter Gemini Donnelly. They courageously moved toward Lee's body, even as the attackers remained nearby. Disregarding the palpable danger, they crossed the road and knelt down beside him. Amanda attempted to cover his body with her coat, providing him a measure of dignity, while Gemini crouched close, speaking to him in a soft voice. She would later recount, "I couldn't just turn my back and leave him there. I wanted to show Lee that someone was there for him." Neither of these women retreated. As one might expect in this situation, a state of shock and panic took hold. People struggled to process what they were witnessing. Some bystanders began recording the incident on their phones as others were calling the police. In fact, The two perpetrators actually urged the onlookers to dial 999, and then they simply waited for the authorities to show up. But then one of the men noticed a person filming, and seized it as an opportunity to deliver a statement on camera. He proclaimed, "The only reason we have taken this man's life today is because Muslims are dying daily at the hands of British soldiers." He characterized the act as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth form of retribution. The man then apologized to the women, who had been forced to witness such a brutal scene, but then added, "In our land, our women have to see the same thing." The assailants then implored the people of Britain to remove their government from power and demand that the troops be brought home, so that in their words, everyone could live in peace. One witness later recalled that the perpetrators had a look of pure evil in their eyes, and that before anyone intervened, the pair had attempted to further desecrate Lee's remains. The people who risked their own safety to attend to Lee, and who tried to divert the assailants' attention to prevent any further indignity to his body, are nothing short of true heroes. Metropolitan police officers were promptly dispatched, arriving at the location at 2:29 p.m. However, one of the perpetrators was in possession of a gun. An armed police unit was also sent, and they arrived at 2:34 p.m. The very moment the armed police vehicle pulled to a stop, the two men charged directly at the officers, viewing them as well as legitimate targets. One of the attackers then aimed the revolver directly at the police. The armed officers had no other choice but to open fire, discharging a total of 8 shots. Both men were struck and fell to the ground. The individual holding the firearm sustained severe injuries to his hands from the police gunfire. Even after being shot, Adebowale raised his handgun and attempted to fire. However, he was using a rusted, old firearm that was no longer capable of discharging. Once the threat was neutralized, armed officers administered first aid to the assailants. Paramedics arrived on the scene shortly after. Both men were transported under guard to a hospital for emergency treatment. Remarkably, no bystanders or police officers were harmed during the confrontation. Paramedics also rushed to Lee's side, but tragically it was far too late. His injuries were exceptionally severe. An extensive collection of evidence was recovered from the scene, including the knives, the meat cleaver, and the firearm. In the hours and days that followed the murder, police and security agencies launched a full-scale investigation. A series of raids were then carried out at multiple addresses, linked to the suspects, spanning locations such as Greenwich, Romford, North London, and even Lincolnshire. The primary objective was to determine if any other individuals were involved. In the subsequent week, authorities apprehended several of the men's associates on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, although ultimately none of these individuals were charged with aiding the crime. By May 31, 2013, a little more than a week after the incident, both assailants had been released from the hospital and transferred directly into police custody. They were swiftly charged with Lee's murder, but the public was left asking, who were these men? Michael Adebolajo, the elder of the two perpetrators, was 28 years of age at the time of the attack. Born in December of 1984, he was brought up in Romford, East London. According to all available accounts, he was raised in a devout Christian home. In fact, his parents were regular church attendees, who provided him with a comparatively stable upbringing. Around the year 2002, at the age of 18, he converted to Islam. Throughout the 2000s, his involvement with hardline Islamist networks within the United Kingdom grew, and significantly, he formed a connection with an extremist figure named Anjem Chowdhury. British authorities were already well aware of him. In 2010, he made a trip to Kenya, with the intention of connecting with a militant organization. However, Kenyan anti-terror police intercepted and arrested him. He would later allege that he was subjected to torture, and even serious personal violations by Kenyan authorities during his detainment. Following this entire ordeal, he was deported and returned to Britain. This incident raised significant concerns for MI5, Britain's domestic security agency. Consequently, upon his return, MI5 conducted an interview with him, and they also made an attempt to recruit him as an informant. Predictably, Adebolajo refused the offer. By this stage, his ideological commitment was deeply entrenched. Subsequent to this refusal, he alleged that MI5 subjected him to a period of harassment. Some analysts speculate that this experience may have only furthered his radicalization against the British government. According to official reports, Adebolajo was not assessed as posing an immediate threat, a judgment that would be tragically disproven by May of 2013. As for the other assailant, Michael Adebowale, he was the junior partner in the attack. He was only 22 years of age at the time. He was born in May of 1992 in the London borough of Greenwich. His own upbringing was comparatively less stable. His mother was employed as a probation officer, while his father served as a government trade diplomat, stationed at the Nigerian High Commission in London. However, his parents separated not long after his birth, and he was raised primarily by his mother. In January of 2008, at the age of just 16, he became the victim of a violent stabbing. He sustained stab wounds during an altercation in which another individual was fatally wounded in his presence. Friends would later suggest that he exhibited symptoms consistent with PTSD after witnessing the homicide and surviving his own near-fatal injuries. They believe this traumatic experience profoundly impacted his life and his psychological well-being. By 2009, at 17 years old, Adebowale had converted to Islam, and he began associating with similar extremist circles. It was within these networks that the two future assailants met, and MI5 was also aware of Adebowale. And much like his counterpart, he was not categorized as an immediate threat. By his late teens and early 20s, he had become firmly entrenched in extremist ideology. However, it was noted that he was more withdrawn and less publicly outspoken. He reportedly struggled with his mental health. According to his family, his use of illicit substances triggered psychotic episodes, and at one point, he was even prescribed medication to manage these conditions. His own mother had reportedly sought professional help for him, on account of his erratic behavior. It appears Adebowale's radicalization was likely influenced by a combination of ideological mentors and personal vulnerabilities, and according to those who knew him by deep personal anguish, he found it difficult to fit in, a struggle compounded by his past trauma and substance abuse. But what's particularly troubling is what happened in December of 2012. He engaged in a Facebook conversation with a man overseas asking for instructions on how to take out a soldier. Now, by this point, MI5 was already aware of his existence, and arguably should have been monitoring him far more closely, but they failed to do so. British authorities would only discover this conversation 6 months later, after the horrific act had already been committed, an act Adebowale would help carry out. The trial for the two assailants commenced at the Old Bailey in London in late November of 2013, a mere 6 months following the attack. Both men entered pleas of not guilty. The defense team faced a formidable challenge as the prosecution presented a case built on robust evidence, which included CCTV footage, multiple eyewitness testimonies of the assault, and the suspect's own recorded admissions at the scene, as well as forensic proof conclusively linking them to the crime. However, their not guilty plea was not an attempt to deny killing Lee. Both men openly acknowledged their actions, but their defense was that what they had done did not constitute murder in the conventional legal sense. They asserted that they were soldiers engaged in a war against Britain, not common criminals, and that Lee was a legitimate military target, by virtue of his membership in the armed forces. The core of their defense was that Lee was not an innocent civilian. In essence, they attempted to frame themselves as combatants in a conflict, and therefore not murderers under the purview of British law. As one might expect, this line of reasoning was not well received in the courtroom. The jury was then required to view the CCTV footage, depicting the moment Lee was struck by the speeding vehicle. The clip was so profoundly disturbing that members of Lee's family left the courtroom in tears, as it was shown. The prosecution then proceeded to present the grim details of the crime scene. Methodically, the prosecutor informed the court how the assailants had first used the car as a weapon to incapacitate Lee, ensuring he could not defend himself. Lee's injuries were then catalogued in stark clinical terms, detailing multiple stab wounds and a near decapitation, which left him with no chance of survival. The court was also informed that they had purchased a set of 5 knives and a knife sharpener just 1 day prior to the attack, a fact that strongly indicated premeditation. The prosecution further argued that there was no sane, political or religious justification for such a brutal act. It was, they contended, murder pure and simple. Driven by extremist ideology, Adebowale took the stand and freely admitted to the killing. He proceeded to describe with a sense of pride and in graphic detail how he had held Lee by the hair while attempting to sever his head. Adebowale exhibited no clinical signs of mental illness and had not been diagnosed with any such condition. He had undergone multiple psychiatric evaluations both before and after the trial. These assessments found no evidence of psychosis, schizophrenia, or any grounds for diminished responsibility. In fact, experts described him as calm, lucid, and driven entirely by ideology. And being fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions, he had informed both doctors and police that his intention was to die that day, as a martyr expressing something akin to disappointment that this outcome had not occurred. Over the course of the trial, the presiding judge referred to him as a self-radicalized fanatic, In contrast, Michael Adebowale had a documented history of mental health issues. He received a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia following the murder, and as was previously established, he had exhibited symptoms of psychosis, which were exacerbated by his use of illicit substances. During the proceedings, psychiatrists testified that he was in fact fit to stand trial, and that he understood the nature of his actions, but they conceded his illness may have rendered him more susceptible to influence, to external pressures during the prosecution. The judge also made a point to acknowledge the courage of several civilians who had confronted the assailants. Individuals such as Ingrid, Amanda, and Gemini received public commendations for their bravery and their self-control. Their conduct on that day was characterized by police as an example of heroism, a testament that in the midst of terror, ordinary people are capable of acting in extraordinary ways. On December 19, 2013, after a deliberation of merely 90 minutes, the jury found both men guilty of the murder of Lee. One of the convicted men reportedly blew a kiss toward the sky and kissed a copy of the Quran as he was escorted away. The sentencing occurred on February 26, 2014. Adebowale was sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. He was given a whole life order. He will never be a free man again. As for the younger man Adebowale, he too received a life sentence in prison. However, he is eligible for parole after 45 years. He was given a reduced sentence owing to his mental state at the time of the incident. Both men would later appeal their sentences. Adebowale argued that a whole life term was excessive, and he even attempted to appeal the murder conviction itself, not just his sentence. Meanwhile, Adebowale also sought a shorter minimum term, believing that his own sentence was far too extreme. These appeals were thankfully rejected. Over time, the two have been held in high-security incarceration. But then, in 2018, Adebowale, the more fanatical of the two killers, and the one who had orchestrated the attack, briefly made headlines from inside prison when reports emerged that he had expressed remorse. He claimed to have been manipulated by extremist ideology and that he had misinterpreted the Quran to justify the taking of Lee's life. He was said to have apologized and told staff he now rejected violence, but Lee's mother publicly dismissed the notion of any genuine change of heart, telling reporters that she did not believe his regret was sincere at all. The murder of Lee in broad daylight on a London street sent profound shockwaves through the UK. There was a spike in anti-Muslim incidents across Britain. At least 10 mosques were targeted in the immediate aftermath. In one case, a man ran into a mosque, armed with knives, and began shouting threats. In another, attackers firebombed a mosque in Grimsby with petrol bombs. And then some who followed ideologies similar to the two killers claimed that the killing was a legitimate act of war, and not a murder. Some went so far as to even suggest that it was deserved. There was one woman who was prosecuted for a social media post, which suggested that people wearing Help for Heroes merchandise deserved a similarly violent fate. Tensions were incredibly high, to say the very least. In response, Muslim leaders and organizations across the UK immediately and unequivocally condemned the attack. They expressed deep sympathy for Lee's family and rejected any link between their religion and the killer's horrific actions. The Islamic Society for Britain said, "This was a barbaric act that goes against everything Islam stands for. We utterly reject and condemn such actions and the twisted narrative that tries to justify them." The family of Michael Adebowale also issued a public statement. They expressed their horror at what he had done and offered their deepest condolences to the Rigby family. While serving his sentence, Adebowale had to be transferred to a psychiatric hospital as he was suffering profoundly from paranoid schizophrenia. In 2018, while confined at this hospital, he assaulted a nurse without provocation, casting a dark shadow over any future chance at parole. It is a stark reality that freedom is a concept he will likely never experience again, a point made moot by the grave dangers that would await him beyond prison walls. His infamy would surely draw those seeking retribution, and so as of 2025, both men remain confined, their fates sealed. Adebowale in particular has earned a grim distinction, becoming one of the most notorious figures in the United Kingdom's recent history. His name is now a permanent scar on the nation's memory.